Welcome to The Questioned, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, I'm Lucy. Today's case is one that has stayed with me since I saw a documentary on it at a very young age. It was one of the first crimes I was ever cognizant of, and one of the first times I was ever aware of the true crime sphere. I was shocked and appalled at the cruelty, and more so that this case concerns a small child. Victoria Climbié, a little girl, 7 years old, who turned 8 in the November before her death. Her case is made even more tragic through the fact her death was preventable. At every possible moment to intervene and save her, Victoria is failed, let down, unnoticed, cast aside, and forgotten. This is a case that reminds me and our nation of the children who slip through the cracks of our protection and welfare system. They are a reminder that time and time again this country has failed to protect children from horrific violence, abuse, and mistreatment. This case is particularly sad because of how many attempts we see within the story were made to safeguard Victoria. How many countless professionals did Victoria come into contact with and still was unable to be saved? Having said this, I believe we also have enough nuance to understand that blame is squarely laid at the perpetrator's door, and individual blaming of social workers, doctors and nurses, and so on, is not helpful. We need to remember it is the system that failed Victoria, and I'm sure the people involved feel bad enough as it is. Victoria Climbié was born on the Ivory Coast to loving parents Francis and Berthe. She was a part of a large family with many siblings. What stands out about this case, among many things, is how Victoria was described by everyone who met her as happy and smiley. Marie-Thérèse Quau was the aunt of Francis Climbié, Victoria's father. In October 1998, Marie-Thérèse Quau visited the Climbié family. She was in the Ivory Coast for her brother's funeral. Although the Climbié family had only met Marie-Thérèse a handful of times, they trusted her and liked her. She was comparatively living a very different life in France to one lived in the Ivory Coast, a life that presented potentially better prospects for work, education, and ultimately quality of life overall. I believe Marie-Thérèse knew the family viewed her in this way, and I think this meant that she felt that she could boldly ask for one of the children to accompany her back to France to live. In the Ivory Coast, this was not an uncommon proposition for a trusted adult or relative from overseas to, in effect, raise a child, bringing them up in another country, where they would be educated and culturally assimilated, essentially expatriating them for a better life. These were informal arrangements, but were more often than not seen as favourable opportunities that would benefit the whole family. I suppose the hope would be that the child becomes well educated and successful and eventually aids and provides for the family back home. But what the Climbié family were unaware of, or as far as I could tell, were not aware that Marie-Thérèse had planned to take another girl back to France named Anna. But her family had changed their minds about the arrangement and was no longer leaving with her. So, the passport Marie-Thérèse had acquired had the name Anna Quau. At just age 7, nearly 8, Victoria was chosen to be her aunt's companion. They made the journey back to France where she lived. I didn't initially realise this, but Marie-Thérèse had 3 sons also living in France, who incidentally all lived from state welfare as well as herself. I couldn't find out much more about her sons or whether they had actually met Victoria or not. Victoria, now legally going by Anna due to her fraudulent passport, procured by Marie-Thérèse, Victoria made it to France with her great-aunt without any questions on the journey or the route through the border security about her identity or why she did not resemble the photograph in her passport. The first of many opportunities missed by authorities to recognise something was wrong. I find it really heartbreaking that had Marie-Thérèse's brother not died or she hadn't been there for a funeral at that specific time, Victoria may still be alive and her life may have turned out very differently. Victoria was enrolled in school in France, but her attendance dramatically declined. It is unclear when Marie-Thérèse began abusing Victoria, but it is clear from the offset that Victoria isn't being cared for in the way she should be. And with Victoria's school attendance not what it should be, alarm bells were starting to be sounded. After several months of Marie-Thérèse making excuses for Victoria's low attendance at school, French authorities became involved and Victoria was deemed at risk. When she did attend school, teachers noticed that Victoria's head was shaved and she was wearing a wig. Marie-Thérèse made an excuse about a skin condition and how shaving her head was necessary to treat the condition. After speaking to the school about Victoria's hair, Victoria didn't attend school again. We can deduce that Marie-Thérèse knew the school were concerned by this point and made the decision to essentially evade and keep Victoria from attending. Marie-Thérèse was also being investigated for fraudulently claiming welfare benefits she was not eligible for. So things for Marie-Thérèse were not looking good and French authorities were beginning to clock her fraudulent activity. As a result, Marie-Thérèse made the decision to effectively flee to evade the French authorities, taking Victoria with her. In April 1999, Marie-Thérèse and Victoria arrive in London and once again no one questions Victoria's passport. As we know, she is still being coached by Marie-Thérèse to go by Anna, and no one questions why Victoria doesn't look like the photograph on her passport. It is important to note that Victoria knew very little English, so this presents a challenge to her when authorities begin to ask or look into her case. Marie-Thérèse and Victoria were moved into temporary accommodation and Victoria was not enrolled in school. Soon after they arrived in London, they met Esther Acker, who was a relative of Marie-Thérèse. Esther noticed Victoria had been, quote-unquote, briefed to respond to Anna. Esther also noticed and thought it was peculiar that Anna/Victoria was wearing a wig, and when she removed the wig, she noticed blisters covering her head, and when Esther asked Marie-Thérèse about this injury, she made an excuse about an accident, possibly something to do with hot water. Esther remarked on how Victoria otherwise seemed quite happy wearing the wig. This is a reoccurring theme for Victoria throughout this case, always coming back to the fact that Victoria, even when injured, seemed very happy and smiley and content. At this point, Marie-Thérèse is attempting to claim government support, assistance and housing with little success. Victoria often would be present at these meetings for assistance, and shockingly, no one inquired as to why Victoria was not at school. Marie-Thérèse then gained employment at a hospital where she met Priscilla Cameron. Priscilla Cameron worked unofficially as a childminder and agreed to look after Victoria rather than Marie-Thérèse leaving Victoria at home when she worked. When Priscilla Cameron looked after Victoria, she seemed happy, smiley, and like any normal 7-year-old little girl. But this all changed when Marie-Thérèse would come to collect Victoria. She would suddenly become withdrawn, and Marie-Thérèse would speak aggressively at Victoria in French. On other occasions, Priscilla Cameron questioned Marie-Thérèse on why Victoria had so many cuts and abrasions. Her excuse was that Victoria had been playing with razor blades. Her excuse was that Victoria had been playing with razor blades, and she had been allowing it for some reason. Marie-Thérèse will rely on the excuse and often repeat the fact that Victoria is supposedly harming herself. Weeks later, Marie-Thérèse and Victoria ran into Esther Acker whilst going about their day. Esther noticed a large, faded, bruising abrasion across Victoria's cheek. And when asked what had happened to Victoria, Marie-Thérèse once again made up an excuse and said that Victoria had fallen on an escalator. This was a very serious abrasion to Victoria's face, and although healing, it was not something that could be caused by simply falling down. Esther also noticed Victoria was unusually dressed for the warm weather. She had too many clothes on. She was covered head to toe. This was remarkably strange. Esther also noticed that Victoria appeared smaller and frailer since the last time she saw her, and Victoria was still not enrolled in school at all. Esther made plans to visit Victoria and Marie-Thérèse in the hostel they were staying in. Esther saw the hostel and believed the living conditions were not adequate at all. The hostel was dirty and small and not appropriate for a 7-year-old little girl. Shortly after this, Esther anonymously phoned social services and reported her concerns for Victoria's welfare and living situation. She was reassured that a referral was going to be made imminently. Several weeks pass and still nothing happened to aid Victoria's situation. Esther calls again to chase up the report and inquire what has happened and what has been done since. But to no avail. She was given vague assurances on the phone at best, and the second phone call once again had not triggered any action in the form of a referral. In the June of 1999, Marie-Thérèse meets a bus driver, Carl Manning. The two strike up a relationship almost immediately, and by July, less than a month later, Victoria and Marie-Thérèse move out of the hostel and they move in to Carl Manning's 1-bedroom flat. The flat is small, inadequate for 3 people to live, but nonetheless they move in. Marie-Thérèse's request for social housing is denied because Carl Manning's flat is deemed appropriate for all 3 to live. Victoria was sleeping on a dishevelled and dirty sofa bed that was not fit as a permanent sleeping arrangement, but this appeared not to be taken into account or not important enough to grant social housing. When social services go to the hostel for a home visit, it is only then that they discover Victoria and Marie-Thérèse are no longer living there and do nothing to follow up on their current living situation or ask where they have gone or show any concern for Victoria's whereabouts or welfare. In fact, it seemed the social workers who visited had very little knowledge on the case at all. Things only got worse at Carl Manning's flat. Manning took an instant dislike to Victoria. Later in the trial, it would be discovered that Manning would refer to Victoria as the devil and Satan Anna in his diary. She's a little girl. One evening in July 1999, Marie-Thérèse takes Victoria out into the night and turns up at Priscilla Cameron's doorstep, saying that she can't keep Victoria and Priscilla should have Victoria because Manning disliked her. Priscilla obviously says that she can't just have Victoria. She could see Marie-Thérèse was angry and agitated, so suggested that Victoria would stay the night at the Camerons, but Marie-Thérèse would have to make plans for Victoria and come and collect her in the morning. When Priscilla asked Victoria to remove her hat, as she was inside now, she saw Victoria had some horrendous injuries to her face and head. Victoria's injuries were so severe, she had been left with a piece of skin hanging loosely from her eye, and she had a burn on the side of her cheek. There were cuts and burns all over her body. She was horrendously injured. Priscilla remarked on how, after all of this, she was smiling. The Camerons were worried about Victoria and her injuries. Priscilla's daughter escorted Victoria to the hospital the following day. This just goes to show the whole family were concerned and how kind they are. Victoria's injuries were extensive. Cigarette burns, cuts, bruises, abrasions, faded and fresh marks all over her body. A nurse observed the imprint of a belt buckle on Victoria's skin. I can't express the amount of force that a belt buckle would have to have in order to inflict a lasting imprint on someone's skin for an extended period of time. This was clearly non-accidental abuse, and doctors were also sure these injuries had to be deliberate. Marie-Thérèse once again makes the pathetic excuse that Victoria has done this to herself, claiming that due to her scabies, Victoria had scratched herself and apparently caused, a belt buckle imprint? I didn't realise scabies did that. Scabies also clearly doesn't cause cigarette burns, does it? Unbelievably, a consultant signs Victoria off as having scabies and agrees with this diagnosis. After countless other staff members have noticed the horrific and non-accidental state of Victoria's injuries, once again, Child Protective and Social Services are alerted to Victoria's situation and case. Social worker Lisa Arthurworry and PC Karen Jones are assigned to Victoria's case. By this point, Victoria's case has already come into contact with several different social, child protective and medical services, and that's not mentioning accommodation concerns. She's come into contact with countless adults who are and were concerned for her welfare and safety, and still their due diligence and reporting has come to very little being done. The relevant authorities have failed to remove or protect Victoria from harm's way. Social worker Lisa Arthurworry and PC Karen Jones arrange a home visit. This visit is cancelled. Why? Because of the risk of catching scabies if they visit. I just want to remind everyone that scabies is a contagious skin disease caused by mites and does not go away on its own. It is, however, easily curable and can be cured by a pharmacist using specific creams or lotions in a relatively quick time period. For an adult, it's quite easy to go to the pharmacy or a GP and get this sorted. For a 7-year-old girl who doesn't speak very much English and doesn't have a caring or kind adult looking after her, who is suspected of non-accidental harm against her, then it's not quite so easy. If untreated, scabies can lead to septicemia and heart and kidney problems. But social worker Lisa Arthurworry and PC Karen Jones thought they would give it a miss because I guess going to the pharmacist would be too much inconvenience to them. So I guess Victoria just continues having scabies. Now, it's irrelevant whether Victoria has scabies or not, whether this is true or an excuse from Marie-Thérèse. However, the fact that 2 trained professionals who are specifically employed to care about her welfare and safety are not making sure she is receiving treatment for this disease because they themselves want to avoid it is both negligent and nonsensical. Also, imagine not only is Victoria being horrifically abused and mistreated, the officials who are meant to safeguard her are essentially afraid to go near her and are treating her like a pariah. Aside from not doing a job, wouldn't that just hurt anyone's feelings? That people don't want to go near you? And yet again, in the same month of July 1999, Victoria is taken to Middlesex Hospital for severe scalding to her head and face. There is no way scalding this severe could be self-inflicted in any way, and doctors agree that these are non-accidental injuries once again. I had to double check this next part because I was so surprised. By this point, Victoria has attended Middlesex Hospital twice in the same month with severe injuries, this time even more horrific than the last time. It is late July, or between late July and early August of 1999. Marie-Therese tells social worker Lisa Arthurworry and PC Karen Jones that once again Victoria has harmed herself due to scabies. She states that Victoria has held her own head under the hot tap to the point of scalding to relieve the itchy scalp caused by scabies. Not to point out the obvious, but for a child or an adult to hold your head under the hot tap on the hottest setting to the point of scalding is unthinkable. And I don't believe anyone really could do it, especially with someone who has all of their nerves intact. The sensation alone would be too much to bear. When Marie-Therese couldn't explain the other injuries that were not scalding, she said that they must be self-inflicted and that Victoria must have used utensils to cause them. Once again, she is suggesting that Victoria has done this to herself. This explanation is accepted by Child Protection and Social Services. Seriously, they accepted that she had been harming herself and that the scalding was due to scabies. They accepted it and moved on. A quote from the inquiry after Victoria's death stated that, during her time in hospital, Quao and Manning visited Victoria, whose behaviour changed in their presence. She appeared afraid of them. Miss Arthurworry and a police constable visited Victoria on the 6th of August 1999 and decided it would be appropriate for her to be discharged back into Quao's care. October 1999 to January 2000. This winter was a cold one. The temperatures of the winter in 1999 mostly sat below 5 degrees Celsius. In a final inquiry report on Victoria's death and the circumstances that led to it, it stated, since moving in with Manning, Victoria had become at times incontinent of urine and often wet herself and the bed. In October 1999, the sofa bed on which she had been sleeping was thrown out of the flat, and Victoria began to spend her nights in an unheated and unlit bathroom. Victoria was forced to sleep inside the bath inside Carl Manning's flat. She is tied up with masking tape and she is led inside a bin bag. She is surrounded by her own excrement and urine inside the bin bag. She can barely move, and when she is permitted to move, she is hunched over and frail. Victoria is being starved for days on end, and when she is allowed to eat the meagre leftovers of Marie-Therese and Carl Manning, it was placed on plastic, and Victoria's only option was to press her face into the food. It was also said in the inquiry after her death by Neil Garnham QC, the food would be cold and would be given to her on a piece of plastic while she was tied up in the bath. She would eat it like a dog, pushing her face into the plate, except of course that a dog is not usually tied up in a plastic bag full of its own excrement. To say that Quao and Manning treated Victoria like a dog would be wholly unfair. She was treated worse than a dog. In November 1999, Marie-Therese makes a shocking report to social services. She tells them that Carl Manning, her boyfriend, who Victoria and herself are living with, is sexually abusing Victoria. It is implied that when social services offered to move Marie-Therese and Victoria back into temporary accommodation and not into a home of their own, she then withdraws the allegations the next day. Manning denies all of these allegations, especially as he is in the room with Marie-Therese when she makes them. It can't be conclusively proved that Manning did or did not sexually abuse Victoria. However, there was nothing to suggest this in Manning's diary or police interviews, in both of which he was sickeningly truthful about his treatment and feelings towards Victoria. Social worker Lisa Arthurworry did believe that this was a ploy for access to social housing. Whether the allegations were true or not, this is a very concerning viewpoint for a social worker to take when presented with a situation that is clearly unsafe for a child to be in, especially as so little was done to investigate it. PC Karen Jones was asked to investigate why the claim had been withdrawn, but seemingly takes no further action after sending a letter to Marie-Therese and receiving no reply. I realise letters are one of the ways of keeping records and keeping tabs, but what was this going to do realistically for Victoria's situation? And if she was being sexually abused, it was firstly known about by PC Jones, and secondly, continuing to happen, and thirdly, no one was physically doing anything to remove Victoria from harm's way yet again. During the winter of 1999 to the February of 2000, there were only 4 occasions Victoria was seen by any professionals. Social worker Lisa Arthurworry made only 2 of these visits. Although I couldn't verify this, it is suggested in documentaries that Lisa Arthurworry did also attempt to visit the flat outside of working and was met with no answer or response from the inside of the flat. Very sadly, if this is the case, and it is in fact true, Victoria was once again so close to an adult who was still trying to help her and intervene, but no closer to it taking effect. If true, Victoria would only be mere meters away in a cold bathroom, tied up, waiting for someone to rescue her. Sometime in early 2000, Arthurworry assumes that Marie-Therese and Victoria have gone back to France. No representative from Tottenham Child and Family Centre, to which she had been referred to by Haringey Social Services, ever visited Victoria at Manning's flat. She was registered in November at the health centre that stands approximately 100 yards from Manning's flat, but she never attended it, and none of the medical staff who worked there ever saw her. At this point, Victoria is not being seen by any medical professionals. She is not being seen by social services an appropriate number of times, and agencies she has been referred to or registered with are not visiting her either. She is in the system on paper, but no one has eyes on her. February 2000. At this point, Victoria has gone months without any professionals seeing her, visiting her, or inquiring about her in any way. In February 2000, Marie-Therese takes Victoria to the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God on Seven Sisters Road. Victoria is worryingly ill at this point. I would like to point out this branch of Christianity believes that epilepsy is caused by demons and is a spiritual problem. They believe in conversion therapy and has recently been accused of illegally removing children from South America and having them adopted abroad. Oh, and money laundering, they do that too. But yes, Marie-Therese takes poor Victoria to this quote-unquote church, as if she hasn't endured enough. The pastor at the church, Pastor Lima, expressed the view that Victoria was possessed by an evil spirit and advised Qual to bring Victoria back to the church a week later. Upon actually seeing Victoria, Pastor Lima thought they should go to a hospital and called a taxi immediately. Victoria at this stage is cold to the touch. She is shivering. She is malnourished and starving. Every part of her body is injured in some way. She's emaciated. She's in and out of consciousness, barely keeping awake. She is partially incontinent. Her movement is limited. She is hunched over when she attempts to walk. Her whole body is restricted. The taxi driver was so worried and concerned for Victoria's welfare, he pulls into Tottenham Ambulance Station for some immediate assistance. Hypothermia has taken hold of 8-year-old Victoria, and her state is so critical that her body temperature can't even be read by the medical equipment because it is just so low. Victoria is 27 degrees Celsius compared to the normal 36 to 37 degrees. She is, however, still alive, but she has been beaten down, malnourished, and cold for so long her organs are beginning to fail. In an attempt to save her, Victoria was transferred to the paediatric intensive care unit at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. As Victoria's condition worsened and her cardiac, respiratory, and renal systems began to fail, she went into cardiac arrest. Attempts were made to resuscitate her to no avail. Victoria Climbié died at 3:15 p.m. on the 25th of February 2000. In a cruel twist of irony, this was also the day that Haringey Social Services had previously chosen to close Victoria's case after hearing no response from Marie-Thérèse and discovering Victoria was enrolled in no school, so based on this, assumed the two had gone back to France. The post-mortem found the cause of death was hypothermia caused by malnourishment, a damp environment and restricted movement. The pathologist found 128 separate injuries on Victoria's body caused by both sharp and blunt instruments. No part of her body was spared injury. Marks on her wrists and ankles indicated that Victoria had been tied up. The pathologist reported that it was the worst case of deliberate harm to a child he had ever seen. Marie-Thérèse Qual was immediately arrested on suspicion of neglect and later subsequently charged with murder. Carl Manning was also arrested a day later, which gave him time to quote-unquote clean the flat, but his pathetic and disgusting attempt to minimise the neglect and abuse that had taken place in the flat was futile. Victoria's blood was found on the walls and on Carl Manning's studded football boots, as well as the underside of a different pair of his shoes. Her blood was found all over the flat. There was no hiding it. It was extensive. It was only when the flat was searched that the passport of Anna Qual was found. The name Marie-Thérèse Qual had coached and forced Victoria to comply with. The authorities tracked down, quote-unquote, Anna's parents to notify them of her death. That authorities discovered Victoria was not called Anna at all. This was the first time anyone had recognised that Victoria Climbié had been allowed and successfully travelled on a fraudulent passport. This was the first time anyone had identified her true identity since leaving the Ivory Coast. After deciphering who Victoria was and who her parents were, the Climbié parents, Francis and Berthe, were flown to London to identify her and eventually bring her body home to the Ivory Coast. Victoria's parents were present for the trial of their daughter's murderers. A quote from the inquiry. At his trial, Manning said that Qual would strike Victoria on a daily basis with a shoe, a coat hanger, and a wooden cooking spoon, and would strike her on the toes with a hammer. Victoria's blood was found on Manning's football boots. Manning admitted that at times he would hit Victoria with a bicycle chain. Chillingly, he said, you could beat her and she wouldn't cry. She could take the beatings and the pain like anything. It was obvious that Carl Manning was unflinchingly honest, so much so that investigators were taken aback by his candid retellings of abuse on Victoria. Marie-Thérèse was a different story, however. She brazenly denied any wrongdoing and maintained her ridiculous made-up excuses that Victoria had been possessed by demons throughout the entire trial. The stupidity is inexpressible, and if that wasn't bad enough, she made rude and shaming comments to Victoria's mother and father throughout the trial as well. The absolute temerity of someone so ridiculous and evil. She's on trial for murdering a little girl, and she wants to attempt to shame others like she's got a leg to stand on. Victoria's poor parents is all I can think of, and just this ridiculous excuse for a woman. Neil Garnham QC highlighted 12 missed opportunities to protect Victoria Climbié. As I previously mentioned, she came into contact with several social services, several professionals, several strangers, and even family acquaintances and friends, many of them who very diligently and bravely made the reports and did the right thing, and through no fault of them, nothing was done. Victoria was not saved. The judge, Richard Hawkins, said in the latter part of the trial, quote, "What Anna endured was truly unimaginable." I think this really just does sum up the whole of this case. Whilst I appreciate what he's just said here, I'm a little bit confused. Why is Victoria, and we know her name is Victoria now, still being called Anna in the trial? Is this something legal? Is this to do with the passport? But the fact is that passport was fake. It was fraudulent. It's nothing to do with Victoria, so I can't see that being the reason either. But like I say, I think this definitely sums up a lot about Victoria's case and how the system really did fail her. Because even in her trial, the judge doesn't even have the courtesy to call her by her real name, given to her by her parents, who were there, who were present at the trial. Also, the fact that Anna was the name chosen and given to her by her murderer. I just can't think of any reason why the judge should be calling her Anna. Her name's not Anna, it's Victoria. After Victoria's death, there was a monumental inquiry, which I have quoted from throughout this episode. It interrogated why this was allowed to happen. A small child had fallen through the cracks, and as a result had died. It was outrageous that in one of the safest countries in the world, a child was abused and mistreated to this degree, and all the actions of the system had amounted to little more than a name in a file and not life-saving intervention. The inquiry and Victoria's legacy also partially prompted the invention of the Every Child Matters initiative and Contact Point, organisations that give support to children and ensure that support is efficient and coordinated, allowing professionals to view who else is working with a child. Contact Point was closed in 2010 by the coalition government and was not specifically replaced by any other concrete child protection database. I couldn't really detect any particular reason why this happened other than funding cuts. But I think not only is that a shame, but this particular database could have saved lives. I mean, imagine a government that closes down life-saving social support for children, even if it is costly to run, which there's no real evidence to suggest that it is particularly costly. It really just does sum up a lot of things about this case. The Children's Act 2004 saw changes in child protection management and how policies were applied and structured in the law. Whilst Victoria's legacy did leave a great many positive amendments in the way we manage and think about child protection, she was not the last child that was let down by Haringey Social Services and the system in general. A mere 7 years later, Peter Connolly, also known as Baby P in the press, would die at the hands of his mother and her boyfriend, as well as other near relations, having been in frequent contact with Haringey Social Services, and Haringey Social Services having failed to detect the abuse, which was alarmingly clear in the immediate investigation that followed. What I take away from Victoria's case is that her death was preventable and is a harsh lesson to everyone on the outcome of failing to intervene when a child is at risk in any way. I will remember Victoria's case because her case has really stayed with me, and it has, as I said at the top of the episode, really affected me. And it's just how many times she was missed by the system, and prevailingly she was always smiling and happy and cheerful despite what was happening to her. And I think that's one of the main things that really stays with me about this case. So that was today's episode, a desperately sad story, and one that will continue to stay with me and this country for generations to come. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all the downloads so far. Thank you very much. If you liked this episode and would like to be up to date when new episodes drop of The Questioned, give the podcast a follow or a subscribe, or leave a review if you'd like to, wherever you're listening. The Questioned social medias are on Instagram, The Questioned Podcast, all one word, all lowercase, and the Facebook page is called The Questioned, and there is a case suggestion link on there as well if you want to let me know what you would like to hear. Thank you very much for listening to this episode, and goodbye.